rocky, heated, vitriolic fireworks. Headline catchwords describing the opening of the high-level meeting between China and the United States last week in Alaska. It was the first face-to-face talks between senior officials from both sides since President Biden took office. On the Chinese side, senior diplomat Zhang Chuanjie, a member of the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of China's Central Committee and director of the Office of the Foreign Affairs Commission of the CPC Central Committee, along with State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi. On the U.S. side, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. What exactly went on there? Why the tough opening, and what did the dialogue accomplish? I'm pleased to be joined from Philadelphia by Neysun Mahboubi, research scholar at the University of Pennsylvania Center for the Study of Contemporary China. From Beijing by Zhang Chuanjie, resident scholar at Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Now, I want to give people just a very brief idea of what was said. The opening to the first session of the dialogue last week unexpectedly lasted an hour and a half, during which an unprecedented scene in international diplomatic history, I dare say, unfolded, where the Chinese delegation head, Zhang Chuanjie, went on a 60-minute protest against the U.S. side for breaking basic diplomatic protocol and its condescending tone. He said, "We thought too well of the United States." He said, "We thought that the United States will follow the necessary diplomatic protocols. So for China, it is necessary to make our position clear." He also said the U.S. does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength. So, Mr. Mahboubi, how do you look at the exchanges?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about it. And first, let me just say hello, and also that I recall the last time I was on your show was in January 15th of, I think, 2020, when they had just signed the new Phase 1 trade agreement. And I remember distinctly we were talking about how it seemed as if the U.S.-China relationship was headed in a more maybe beneficial direction. And so about a year and a few months after that, we see that, in fact, the situation has become maybe more fraught than we thought back then. I think, my view is that both the U.S. side and the Chinese side in that public portion of the meeting, we're really speaking not to each other, but to domestic audiences in each country. I think there was almost a kabuki theater aspect to it. Secretary of State Blinken, Jake Sullivan were very much trying to communicate, I think, to a domestic U.S. audience what their perspective is going to be in terms of their approach towards China going forward. And of course, Zhang Chuanjie and Wang Yi we're also, I think, in responding to that, we're speaking to a domestic Chinese audience. And in that respect, I think both sides, they did what they wanted to do. I think, Secretary Blinken's comments were well received in the U.S. press, and President Biden said that he did a good job. Of course, we know that Zhang Chuanjie's remarks were very well received in China. He got some good lines in. I can't deny that he had some good lines. And so we all got to see that show. And then they went behind closed doors, and from what it sounds like, had a more temperature lower type of meeting that had some productive elements to it. Of course, we don't know the details of what happened behind closed doors, but I think it seems fairly safe to assume that behind closed doors was not the same theatrics as we saw publicly.
Okay. Mr. Zhang, do you agree with the assessment that both sides were each respectively speaking to their domestic audiences? For instance, Mr. Yang, do you think he had this in mind, or he really had some important messages he had been, or on behalf of China, on behalf of the Communist Party of China, that he wanted to say face-to-face and in public for quite some time to come?
Yes, I think there's a very strong message from China to the U.S. Because of the uncertainties and also this policy choices of the Trump administration for the last 4 years. I totally agree with Neysun on this on his assessment that both sides are speaking to domestic audience, especially Blinken and Jake Sullivan. I mean, as I said, it doesn't make any sense to invite the Chinese side to go to Alaska in the first place if they wanted to press on these issues. But they have to make this public. They have to, this shackle of nationalistic populism at home and Trump and his supporters. Actually, as I read this morning, the former secretary of the State Secretary Pompeo challenged the Biden team to be too weak on China. So this is something that they have very good reason to be concerned about. So they have to act strong in the public footage. But also, I agree with Neysun that if you read the statements from both sides, actually, behind the doors meeting, I think it's more. I don't want to use the word successful, but more fruitful, because they cover a wide range of issues, regional and global issues. So these are the areas where I think the two sides will have meaningful exchange of words rather than the video footage that we see.
Well, some people have characterized, have talked about this as kind of the culmination of China's changing diplomatic style. For instance, this Wall Street Journal said China has basically stopped smiling, that China has finally really, broken out in public in international stage about its diplomacy and stopped smiling. I want to get both of your assessment on that. Neysun, you first, then Mr. Zhang, on is this a tipping point of China's diplomacy attitude toward the United States, that China is not looking up, is not looking down, of course, but China is looking eye level to the United States and to the rest of the world as well?
So first, let me just say, also agreeing with the earlier comments from my colleague here, that we have to keep in mind for the U.S. side, the political box that they're in from the Trump administration. I happened to catch former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's interview on BBC World, I think the day before the summit. And if you want to contrast the way he talks about China and the way that Secretary Blinken talked, even in those public remarks, there's still a wide difference. So there's some politics there that really has to be noted. But in terms of your question, I almost wanted to go back and see if I could find, footage of other meetings, because in the past, because my sense is that there have been other confrontational meetings that, Chinese diplomats have also spoken strongly in past meetings vis-a-vis the US, vis-a-vis other parties. So I'm not convinced that this was entirely as new. Of course, Yang Jiechi's been doing this a really long time. He was there interpreting for Deng Xiaoping when he met with Jimmy Carter. He's a pro, he's been doing this for many, many years, and I didn't see a completely different individual at the Alaska meeting from the one that we've seen for the last 40 years. It's more pointed than maybe sometimes we've seen him, but it didn't seem to me like it was a completely different type of approach.
All right, Mr. Zhang, your approach?
Is this the tipping point? I don't think so. China has been a growing power. China is growing, and China is pushing for changes, not necessarily on this meeting. For example, as we know, the international institutions right now, as we see them, are more or less reflection of the interests of the developed countries. And China, as a developing country, one of the developing countries, together with other rising, emerging markets like India, Indonesia, they need a voice in these international systems. So that is why China is keep pushing for a more equitable international system or order or institutions. So this is not a change of China. This is just a change of rising economies in the developing countries, and then maybe some repairing work of the current international system. So it's not about China.
Maybe it's a voice that should have been there for long but hasn't been there, and finally it's being filled. But Mr. Yang said something which really left a mark on many audiences. He said the United States don't have the qualification to speak from a position of strength even 20 or 30 years ago. Exactly, Mr. Zhang, exactly what he meant and why he talked about this. And what does that say about China's assessment of, the kind of balance of power or the strengths, and advantages and disadvantages of different systems?
Yeah, actually, Mr. Yang is very much to the point. I mean, the United States, of course, doesn't represent international opinion, but the U.S. doesn't have a really good record on this. You know, back in 1999, they bypassed the United Nations Security Council to have this NATO authorization to go into Kosovo. And in 2003, they even couldn't get an authorization from NATO, so they formed the so-called coalition of the willing, you know, the United Kingdom, Japan, they go into Iraq. So this is not a good record on the side of the United States. Of course, it doesn't represent international opinion. Now, on these two systems, look, back in 1972, when the two sides signed Shanghai Communique, both sides agreed that they will respect each other's different systems and then on this principle of non-interference. And this principle has been reaffirmed in 1979 communique for establishing diplomatic relations, and also August 17, 1982 communique on arms sales to Taiwan. So these three communiques actually form the cornerstone of U.S.-China relationship. So this is a principle that we should uphold, and the United States does not object to that. So this actually makes people question, you know, whether this is double standards on the side of the United States. Go ahead, Neysun. You want to share some of your opinions?
Okay, Neysun, you want to add something really quickly, please?
Sure, yeah, and you know, I think from a U.S. perspective, and I do think we're increasingly going to see, you know, these two different models sort of being compared to each other. I think from a U.S. perspective, I think our approach tends to be to try to be reflective on the mistakes we've made in the past. And I think we're seeing a regenerative phase in the US right now from the change of administration and the, you know, ongoing change of administration from Bush to Clinton to Bush to Obama to Trump now to Biden does allow some changing of the direction of certain policy choices. And I think we have always an ongoing and very robust debate about certain policy choices that have been made. And I think that's part of the strength of the US model. So I think, you know, that this notion of, you know, decline of the US, I don't buy that at all. I think that what we're seeing now is the US reasserting some of the values that it stood for much of its history on the world stage. And, you know, I think this is what we'll have to see how it plays out going forward, how these two different countries with different systems compete with each other on the global stage. I don't think that we can say that one is rising, one is declining. It's too early to say this.
China actually avoids using the term competition. Mr. Yang actually said if there is an element of competition, it would pretty much in the economic side, meaning China does not want to engage in a competition of political models, who's better, who is wrong, or who should be promoted around the world. China has repeated its intention not to advocate or export its models around the world. But let's put that aside and talk about, you talked about the non-interference, and Mr. Wang also added that China certainly in the past has not and in the future will not accept the unwarranted accusations from the US side. China urges the US side to fully abandon the hegemonic practice of willfully interfering in China's internal affairs. It seems that there is a fundamental difference there in terms of how China and the United States believe the world should be organized. For instance, China believes, you know, non-interference in internal affairs are the highest standard or the red line that no country should trample upon. And yet the United States talk about values, you know, the fact that, for instance, some issues transcend national sovereignties. Is this a difference that we're talking about here? Is there any way that the two sides can come to some kind of a reconciliation or middle line, Mr. Zhang?
Well, if people are talking about ideology and the values, that will make life much difficult, you know, much more difficult. Actually, I think my speculation is that the discussion behind the closed doors is more about practical issues. Of course, you know, the Biden team needs some rhetoric to make facing these domestic audiences and then the Trump and his supporters. So I guess, you know, we should spend more time to discuss practical matters like how about get rid of this pandemic and then, you know, economic recovery and also climate change. I think these are the really the more important things rather than, you know, discussing these values or some, you know, domestic issues.
Okay. we...
And if I can just jump in
Yes,
briefly
go
on
ahead.
that, which is just
Briefly, please.
very quickly, just to say that I do very much agree that there are many practical issues, including the pandemic, including climate change, that the two sides can work together productively. But on your original question on the sort of the different ways of thinking about what's going on in each country, I would say from a U.S. perspective, when Yang Jiechi pointed out some of the issues in China, in the U.S. in terms of some of the tensions that we've had over the past year, I think a U.S. perspective is to welcome that conversation. I think we're very comfortable talking about that. And conversely, we think we should be able to talk about the situation of Xinjiang or Hong Kong, and that both sides should have the confidence.
China doesn't want to comment on those issues unless provoked. China doesn't think that it is China's business to go and point fingers at the United States and say you must change this way or that. Only when the United States is doing that to China, China says, okay, you have also these problems. Yes?
Perfectly valid to do. That's the U.S. perspective. I understand that
my
may have a different
opinion
approach
is,
to it, but it seems like a healthy thing.
That's the U.S. understanding
my
of the way of
opinion
doing things. Mr. Zhang, I can't stop here.
Yeah, my opinion is if you keep bringing up these issues, in what way would it help the bilateral relationship? In what way would it help to improve to working toward a more equitable international order or international system? So I believe, as I said before, there are a lot of more important things that we can discuss instead of touching upon this sensitive principle of non-interference and making some, let me use the word show in front of these camera. Doesn't make any sense to me.
Because
of course, I know, yeah.
Because China is not going to budge. Because China is not going to budge. It's not going to say, okay, let's talk about Hong Kong. Let's talk about how to govern Hong Kong. China is not going to budge on that. It's just the same thing as, shall we talk about how to manage Puerto Rico, how to govern Alaska? The United States will never allow anybody else to tell the United States how to govern its own territory.
But I think the point here is that the U.S. is very comfortable with having that conversation. And the thing that I think is very important for Chinese audiences to understand is that the administration in power right now works within a larger political environment. And so there is no way that they cannot bring up those things given U.S. politics. There's no way to dictate the U.S. political discourse that we can't talk about these things. So the question
let me jump in.
Yeah. Okay, Mr. Zhang, finally, we have to wrap it up. Yeah, Mr. Zhang, your point. See, it goes on and on once we touch on these issues.
Having Blinken and Sullivan and the Americans, having them being comfortable doesn't really necessarily make other, people comfortable, right? So these is a lot of differences here. So why do we spend so much time discussing these issues instead of, discussing how we're going to manage the pandemic, how we're going to deal with the climate change?
Okay.
I mean, look at what they are talking behind the doors, right?
Let's hope this kind of candid and comfortable discussion will eventually emerge when both sides commit themselves to continuing talking to each other. Many thanks to my two guests, Neysun Mahboubi joining us from Pennsylvania and Zhang Chuanjie joining us here from Beijing.